today so we can attach it to our meeting minutes and notes. Each month after our meeting, Karen completes the meeting minutes and notes, and then we attach the video to that so you can see it on YouTube later on if you miss one. So we appreciate everybody for understanding that we are recording this meeting. I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Colleen Haggerty. Colleen is an independent multimedia journalist specializing in disaster coverage. She's reported extensively on policies, key players, and impacted communities in this space for outlets including BBC News, The Guardian, The Washington Post, and Popular Science. Some of her recent publications include In Place of Sandy Ravaged Homes, A Living Beach Helps New Jersey Prepare for the Next Storm, and you can read that in Washington Post. Disasters Are Changing the Role of Educators, High County News, and The Guardian. How Disasters Are Redefining the High School Experience, in Teen Vogue. The Quest to Find African American Graves Before They're Lost to Climate Crisis, The Guardian. Emergency management professionals are burning out after handling record-breaking disasters for a year straight, in Business Insider. Most Americans are not prepared for disaster. Now survival kits are all over Instagram, on Vox. And how Facebook disaster groups turn on themselves, on 1-0. She also has a disaster-focused newsletter, My World's on Fire, which was shortlisted for a 2002 Covering Climate Now award. Colleen previously worked as a video journalist for BBC News, a supervising producer for Now This, and an on-air reporter for NY1. And you can subscribe to her newsletter on her website at colleenhaggerty.com/newsletter. Colleen, thank you so much for being with us today, and we are all engaged in your presentation. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. That was such a lovely introduction. I really appreciate it, and I'm very excited to be here today. So I do have a few slides that I'm going to try to figure out how to share. I'll admit that I'm more of a Zoom than Teams person. So just trying to figure out how to get just the one open. Okay, I see it. There we go. I think I might horrify everyone if you saw how many tabs I have open. I tend to keep my research always there. Okay, can everyone see this screen now?
Yes, we see the screen with all of your slides.
All right. So I am going to have it up like this. We do full screen here. All right, so I know you all just heard my bio. Again, really appreciate the ability to be here today. I think especially with some of the news happening this week, it's just really great to have the opportunity to connect with people in your position. And I always like to say, I mean, I'm so grateful for the officials, people in emergency management who take the time to speak with me all the time, both for articles I'm working on and also just on background to help me better understand the work that you do. I think, you know, I've heard a lot from people in your positions about the value of blue sky days and taking advantage of those to be able to kind of create these relationships. And I absolutely agree that I think it's just something that's really important to do. So I always like to start off whenever I'm talking, just kind of getting people in the news mindset of thinking about our own media diets. As I've presented this, I've kept adding to the list of places that people can get news. And it's something that's just been really interesting for me to see. I know I'm a Twitter person. I turn to Twitter first thing in the day. I also get a lot of newsletters as well as writing my own. But it's been really interesting to present to different people and see the different outlets that they turn to first. And one that I just always like to mention is that I presented to a college classroom a few months ago, and I was really expecting maybe like TikTok and Snapchat to come up there, but by far the largest news source, the most hands that were raised in that class were for YouTube. So just something that I found helpful to keep in mind. Always like to pass that along, but figured I'd put that up there. Everyone can kind of think about some of our own media diets. And then I like to just ask people why that's their source of choice. I think we all kind of can get in a habit of turning to certain sources and then maybe adopting more as we go on without really analyzing why we go to them. So as a journalist, it's something that's always personally interesting to me. But I think it's also something that's worth analyzing when we're thinking about disasters, journalism, risk communication, just why we all turn to the sources we turn to, what's comfortable about that, familiar and trusted. So happy to talk about this more when I open it up to Q&A in a bit, but just getting us all in the mindset. So I know some of my work was just mentioned, but I think it can be helpful just to talk a bit about how I found myself so interested in this space. And I started off as a more general assignment reporter. So I was really covering anything that happened on a given day, and disasters became a part of that, of course, and unfortunately. I can't say right away that was where I saw my path going. I did politics for a bit, kind of more environmental focused work, really sort of all over the map. But this was a space where, whether I was working in a local newsroom, sort of digital, international, wherever I was, I just really found myself walking away from stories and the assignments that I was on and feeling like there was so much more that I hadn't been able to share, so much more from my interviews, so much more background and context that maybe wasn't going to fit in like the 2-minute TV news hit that I had to do. If any of you have spoken with journalists, I'd wager that you're familiar with giving very long interviews and then maybe having like a sentence put in there or a quick soundbite clip. It's something that I think is frustrating on our end often as well, because there's usually so much more you want to be able to share, and there are those constraints that you face. But especially with disasters, I just found myself really feeling like there were more stories to tell and really important stories to tell. So that's how I kind of started pursuing that as an independent journalist when I had the ability to really shape the work that I was doing more than I did when I was in a newsroom. So this photo was up on the first slide I put up, but this was the first federally declared disaster that I covered. I was working for a local TV news station in 2012. I was pretty new to the job. And I remember the week before Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy came through to New York City, where I was, that we had maybe one newsroom meeting that kind of laid out that this was going to be something a bit different. We had done some extreme weather stories before, but nothing that had this sort of forecast, of course. And that's about all I remember from preparation. I mean, there were a lot of emails that went around, but it's something I always like to talk about because I think local newsrooms, especially now, tend to be pretty strapped, whether it's financially, for time, for staff. And you might imagine there's more conversations that go on sometimes than there unfortunately are. And of course, this is a storm. So we did have some preparation for it compared to other hazards that might be, more breaking news jumping into it in the moment. So despite the fact that we knew something was coming, it really was a bit of a rush to get crews on the ground for us. When I was deployed out there, I think I was told it would be for one overnight. I was staying on Staten Island, which was forecasted to be one of the hardest hit areas, and did end up being one of the hardest hit areas in the New York City region. And we were really, I think, unprepared is fair to say for the level of destruction that was caused, for the personal shakeup of I was couch surfing from like some of my colleagues' parents' houses because we just didn't have a place for journalists to be staying. Hotel rooms were being given to residents who had been displaced. We didn't have power. We didn't have like any sort of backups. Our main newsroom was back in Manhattan, so we didn't really have the ability to go back and do those check-ins. We were operating largely from satellite phones to communicate with producers and figure out when our live hits were happening. And when we would hit, when I'd hit the record button, I had no idea if it was even going on air because we just had such little communication. So it was really a scenario that was all hands on deck, and also figuring it out as we went along. And I remember a day that there felt like a significant change was when the politicians started coming in, when the national media followed them. Before that, I think there were about 3 or 4 days that it just felt like we were kind of throwing things out there, recording it, and having no idea who was seeing it, aside from, because of the residents that we were interfacing with on Staten Island did not have power. So they weren't necessarily getting most of our dispatches. I think it's also important to note here that we hadn't had any specific safety training for filming during hurricanes. And again, I just think it's helpful for people to know that this is sort of what journalists are often walking in with. I had a colleague whose car washed away pretty early on during the storm. And it was just a scenario where there was a lot that was left to be learned. And thankfully, everyone was able to stay safe. But I do know, particularly in the weeks and months to follow, that there were some of my colleagues who really struggled with some of the things they had seen and not feeling like they had been equipped for that or had the ability to process it afterwards. So just to kind of dive into local news a bit more generally, having worked in a variety of newsrooms, I've really seen the difference in working in local news in terms of being able to directly communicate niche, small community warnings and resources to people, and how valuable that is. And it's something that I think is concerning given the state of local news. Local newspapers, local television stations have been progressively shutting down across the United States. They are severely underfunded. I can speak to my first job and say I made, I believe, less than what was minimum wage because I was a contracted employee at the time. So it was a difficult situation to be in as someone straight out of college. So it's a very precarious field right now, despite the fact that a lot of the information can be so essential. And the reporting I was able to do in that role, the way I was able to follow up on the storm, I mean, from being on the ground the day of and really knowing the community, the reporters and we all lived in the neighborhoods that we were reporting on. We knew what areas flooded because it wasn't just a big storm, right? Like those areas were flooding year round on smaller unnamed storms. So we had that familiarity. We knew who to talk to. We could drive around without needing our phones to connect to have GPS. We knew the officials to call, the different local leaders. So we had that familiarity, and we had the ability to really say, here's where your local, FEMA center is. Here's the aid distributions that are best in your neighborhood, and follow the story. I mean, I was reporting on it for years, from local community meetings to residents who still weren't able to get back into their homes for maybe 5 years after the storm. So it's just a level of attention and detail that you can't get, as I'll talk about, from larger newsrooms. So I think it's really essential and concerning to see how that is changing. So to jump in time a bit forward, I wanted to talk about the perspective from a larger newsroom and how some of the more national or even international outlets approach disasters, because of course it's a bit different given the capacity, location of reporters, a bunch of different measures. So the Camp Fire was another federally declared disaster that I personally covered. And I was working at a large newsroom at the time. So when the fire broke out, it wasn't a matter of immediately deploying someone there as much as it was we had 24/7 journalists on staff. So people were immediately able to kind of use wire footage from AP, from other publishing partners we had, to start putting together the report, to start sharing what was happening with our audience. And then they were able to step back and say, okay, is this something where we want to deploy our reporters? In this case, certainly the answer was yes. So we had sent a breaking news TV crew, the closest reporters we had. They went up there, stayed for a bit, and then I was the second wave of journalists who went up. I was working for the digital arm of the outlet, and I was doing sort of the step back, more context and sharing a bit more about the human impact as residents were able to return to the area, to return to their homes, or return to the damage of the communities that they lived in. So a very different process that had, a bit more planning behind it, because we had the luxury of being able to take that step back, to work with content partners, to publish what else was out there versus really needing to get people on the ground as fast as possible. Still, of course, we wanted to be on the story. So it is getting people out to that community. And this was a newsroom that had more resources to provide some safety training and also send people out in slightly bigger crews. So while I went out on my own for the second deployment, the first group of people who went, they were dressed in, proper gear. We had CAL FIRE employees who came and spoke with us and gave us some briefings ahead of fire season. So they were able to give us some, best practices, tell us who to contact first, just generally set a scene for us. So we'd be a bit more prepared going into it, and it would be a safer experience for everyone. So that was something that I'll say was incredibly valuable. It's information I still carry with me today, and I'm just such a proponent of being able to have those conversations, if possible, when resources allow, because I know it changed my experience of feeling like I was walking in kind of knowing how to not only be safer for myself, but keep this a safer experience for everyone involved who was doing the reporting on either side. So that was a significant difference from local news to being in this type of newsroom. And the reporting I was able to do here, it sort of set the scene of what had happened during the campfire. It really focused on the resident experience and was very narrative driven from what residents went through. But it was also kind of ended there. We talked a bit about next steps and what was expected to happen. But after I went out as sort of the second crew to cover this story, which was, of course, a huge international story, it wasn't something that the newsroom necessarily followed up on. It's been mentioned in reporting in the years since. There have been some features that kind of look at one aspect of it for different parts of the website, but you're not necessarily getting the updates of 6 months later, what does this look like? And what is the permitting process? And how many residents were able to receive FEMA aid? Those are the types of details that just aren't usually prioritized in a national newsroom, because you do have constant new news coming through, and you just aren't able to really delve into things and keep that hold for the long run. So it's different priorities that local, national, international news have. And it's not to say one is better than the other, but I just think it's helpful to know, if you're in the position of talking to reporters from one type of outlet or the other, of what they're really looking for. So this international or national news is often referred to as parachute journalism, since the reporters are flying in and out of town. That it does tend to have some degree of negative connotation to it within the industry. But I can certainly say, having worked on both sides of that it brings so much more attention, aid, and accountability to a disaster when you have these larger outlets coming in. I would hear about doing a story, and then people would call me and say that they had received aid from a different continent, that someone who maybe had dealt with fire in South America had sent them aid, or reached out with resources. Accountability wise, you really are getting those calls back from people when you're trying to make those connections. You just see that impact on a different scale when it's the national or international news. So I think there's certainly a place for both of those, but it is different spheres. And as I said, it tends to lack some of that in-depth follow-up coverage that you really do see, even though you can sometimes see reporters who have the ability to pursue more accountability reporting. The Washington Post is one outlet that is great about that, because they have the data journalists, they can map things, they can put in FOIA requests. They really have that ability, versus a local newsroom. You might be a bit more having to deal in the day-to-day.
Hey, Jim, it's Walt. I'm calling you on the side of this briefing. I'm going to sign off when I've been on these briefing calls just about all day, but I don't see any.
All right, Colleen, I'm sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay. Okay. So just to kind of sum up all of that, when we start hearing about something like this in a newsroom, you tend to get a bit of an all hands on deck approach, whether it's summing it up virtually or trying to deploy crews to it. The coverage focuses on disasters as an event more. So really when something like a hurricane is making impact or a fire is coming through versus sort of looking at the longer term scope of an area. And there's a need for first person stories, strong visuals, quick expert responses. Those are really on both sides of local, national, what people are looking for. And the impact that I know I've personally seen is the ability to inform a broader audience about the situation, hold officials with power accountable to what they're saying in the moment, and inform people about risks and aid options available. On the longer term, as I said, it's dependent on the type of newsroom, but a lot of times you'll see coverage that's more related to a news hook. So if there's a study, a program, or of course, if there's an anniversary, you're going to see a bit more coverage around that. And then you can see the impact of, bringing aid back to a community, following up on promises that were made, and giving the opportunity to highlight ongoing issues so that maybe those can be addressed before they are disasters in the future. And I just always like to end with this example. So I mentioned that Hurricane Sandy was the first federally declared disaster that I covered, but I realized in the years since it was not the first disaster I covered for that newsroom. One of my first stories was covering a heat wave that came through New York City that year. And I remember being told, go show people eating ice cream, maybe kids in a fountain. I think I went to one cooling center, but it was really just to kind of have people on the street saying, yeah, it's really hot out. In retrospect, when I looked back on it years later, this was actually a deadly heat wave. Dozens of people died across the area that was impacted. And it was something that I think at the time didn't necessarily register with people as being a disaster as much as it does now with the changing conversations around climate and the fact that something doesn't need to have that sort of massive, event impact like a hurricane to be a disaster, that something like heat is actually a particularly deadly disaster. So I think that these conversations are changing in newsrooms, not to say that journalists are doing anything perfect, but I just think it's an important note that there is this shift in understanding of what this looks like, of needing to take into account vulnerabilities that maybe hadn't been there quite so much before. So now I would love to turn it over to everyone else. I know we have about half an hour here, and I'd love to hear if there's anything I can share that would be particularly helpful for you. I put up some general ideas, but open to any types of questions that you might have.
Well, Colleen, I'll start. And first, thank you for talking with us today and for your service to the communities who do experience disasters. When you mentioned the heat wave, I was thinking of the Chicago heat wave back in the 90s. Yeah. And to your point exactly, different cultures responded differently. And there were a lot of deaths of people who lived in isolation or otherwise did not have air conditioning or were afraid to go out in the community. So those are things that we definitely tried to implement into our excessive heat plan. And you mentioned something that I don't think we remember enough, and that the journalists and the reporters are survivors too. They are people in our community who equally, suffered through a disaster, a storm. Recently in 2019, we have our mass shooting in Virginia Beach, and we tried to promote to them the need for incident stress management because they were seeing things and reporting on things that people really shouldn't have to. So knowing that they're responders as well, and they should have resources available to them. I am proud of the relationship that we have with our local media partners. I've seen where it's been pretty adversarial in other places. So I like what we have in place. I guess what I wanted to ask you, Colleen, is what could we do better to work with our media partners? I mean, knowing that they have a job to do, a story to get out, and then quite frankly, a lot of times it's a story that we want to get out to keep our community informed. How would you recommend we work better with them?
Sure. First off, I think that's really great that you were able to share those resources. Unfortunately, I've also covered mass shooting events in my career, and I know that it was a very difficult time, I think, for anyone who has any sort of involvement with those events. So I appreciate that you thought of journalists in that moment and shared some options for support. You know, I think in a dream world, what I'd say is I think a lot of times the tension that tends to arise between journalists and officials, particularly when you're dealing with disasters, is that need for information as fast as possible. And I, of course, understand the protocols that exist, the need to be sure of what's being said before information is shared. But I guess it's just that understanding of knowing that when you're getting that pestering from a journalist, it's really that oftentimes we're trying to get that information out as quickly as possible. And I think understanding the changing landscape that we're all dealing with social media is a huge part of that. I think we can look at what's happening in Ohio right now, for example, and see how much misinformation is out there, how many rumors are being treated as facts, particularly on social media. I mean, I know what I'm seeing circulated most widely is not news from officials, it's not news from journalists, it is people on TikTok who are putting videos together, it is, people who are rounding photos up and creating Twitter threads. So I think a lot of it is journalists trying to respond quickly and preempt that type of news from taking hold, and then wanting that information as fast as possible from officials. So I think just having that communication open and everyone kind of being upfront about, if you're not going to be able to share something right away, letting journalists know, telling them maybe when they can expect it would be really helpful. And I know I mentioned in there how I was able to meet with some CAL FIRE officials ahead of wildfire season and how helpful that was. I know everyone's busy, so not to throw something else on your plate, but if there is an opportunity to ever have some sort of session where you just go into a newsroom one day and are open for questions on background or off the record with journalists, kind of can talk them through, kind of like what this all looks like on your end, or give any safety tips. I think most newsrooms that I've worked in, if not all of them, would be really open to having that kind of dialogue and getting that sort of information. So if you do have someone who's a source at one of these newsrooms who you're comfortable kind of reaching that with, I think any type of conversations that can happen before a disaster are really helpful.
Awesome. Thanks, Colleen. And
Yeah.
I guess part of the frustration too is once those relationships are built, then they move on to a bigger area, a bigger market.
Yeah.
And so you relationships, but it is what it is. But I'm curious. So Colleen, the emergency manager, is in front of the podium, speaking to a bunch of reporters about an incident, and there's local reporters and there's national reporters. Whose needs are you addressing and trying to meet the most?
That's a really good question. I think local, first and foremost, is really important because that is kind of like the direct source of, those are the people who are going to be able to get out the information that I think is most critical to your community. And making sure that those local outlets know to direct people to the right places is really critical. That's not going to make it necessarily onto the national news, but the national news cameras are good at pulling you aside and making sure that they get their comment as well. And almost certainly something that you're saying when you're giving they're really probably looking more for like a full rundown of what the incident is. That's probably more along the lines of what they're going to use, or any information on impact. So it's less information that is, kind of like the critical safety needed in the community and more summarizing what the situation looks like. So I would say local is my attention in that moment, knowing that national will kind of find their way to get what they need.
Yeah, well, knowing that you're national and international, we'll make sure that you get the information too, along with our local. So
Well, thank you.
before I open it up to others, and because you mentioned Ohio, and because we see it playing out in the media, and we have folks from communications on the virtual call. I'm not going to ask you to judge another locality or any agencies on how well they're doing, but based on what you've seen, what tips might you offer to those communication folks in the room?
Yeah, I mean, I think with this incident in particular, I think there's proven to be a lot of areas that have been difficult. From, of course, the journalist who was arrested during the press conference, that really sounded like a communication failure at its core, in the way that was carried out. And I think, of course, that is always unfortunate to see as a journalist, is, that kind of action being taken. But I also, having reported a lot on the sort of intersection of disasters and social media, I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I've seen that cited as an example of kind of like a larger conspiracy of people trying to keep this incident out of the news. So I think there's a lot of optics around it, as well as that incident itself being really unfortunate that exists. So of course, trying to avoid situations like that, which I think can come down a lot to communication. But I think largely, I'll cite other journalists here who I follow who are really specialized in misinformation and disinformation. And what they've been saying around this is that when you see this kind of vacuum of news coming out from officials, it really does allow those conspiracy theories to sweep in. And it really does create a space where people are turning to players that maybe they wouldn't have if the information was more readily available, and kind of running with some of those ideas. So I think understanding that, we never want to say something that we don't know for sure. I think more communication tends to be better, even if it's, we are running this type of test. These are the officials who are responding. Any sort of information that can be put out there, I think, is going to be helpful in making people feel like this is something that they're being communicated about, that this isn't something that is being put under wraps or kept from either the community that it's happening to or the larger community. And I think some of those issues are what we're seeing here, is that the lack of communication has been concerning. And the last thing I'll say on that as well is that I know, even through the warnings that were put out, that there was some communication, and some of the warning experts who I've spoken with have said that they felt like those could have been better communicated to the public. And I know at one point the guidance was even to turn to your local media source and listen to them for advice. And I think that was potentially concerning for some local media who felt like they weren't hearing that information, and then also being in the position of having to tell people where to go to be safe. I think, again, this is a situation that's unfolding. So the more communication you can have, the better, both for the journalists to be able to share it and for the public to feel like they're informed about their own safety.
Awesome. Well, so selfishly, I will ask one more question after I finish writing my note, not to physically take down any reporters. That seems. The message itself, have you seen any good examples of where, I mean, people understand when we say that there's a storm coming, they're pretty familiar with what the hazards are and what they need to do. But when you're talking about a train load of ethyl methyl death, and they have no idea how severe the hazard is, they seem less inclined to act on it if they understand it less. So from a behavioral health or behavioral science standpoint, have you seen messages that provided contextual statements, the level of, exposure is similar to, whatever. I mean, have you seen any good examples of that in any localities?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say with this incident, I think it's something I've seen because I come from the place of following so many experts on social media, and I know that that is not the norm. That's a bug because of the job that I do, where I have been able to feel like I have a deeper understanding because I follow people who are, so versed in this. In terms of that being done on kind of a broader scale, I know one thing we've done here in California, and I believe other states have as well, is just even talking about like the difference between an evacuation order and an evacuation warning. I think some of that language can be confusing. And I'm trying to remember the exact example. It was something with tacos where it was like, if you have all the ingredients for tacos, it's this, and if they're prepared, it's if you have all the ingredients, it's a warning, and if they're prepared, it's like an order. I will try to find it and I'll send it to you after this. But I feel like anything you can do that really clarifies language is helpful. I also was following yesterday when there was the truck that overturned in Arizona, and I feel like quite quickly there was some information out there about what the specific chemical was that had been released, and some of the reactions that could happen to that. And I saw that coming out mostly through local news. I think that was perhaps more effective in that immediately it was sort of like, this is what it is, and this is why it's dangerous. I think, again, it's tough to say because, of course, the other incident had happened in Ohio. I know there have been a few other smaller incidents in the time since. So people are kind of more attuned to it at the moment, and certainly amplifying it more, paying more attention. But I did feel like that information was shared a bit more readily than what we were seeing in Ohio. So I guess that would be one example.
Thank you, Colleen. Any questions in the room?
I have a question, Colleen. Can you talk a little bit more about journalist safety training?
Sure. Yeah, so this is something that I can certainly speak to from my experience and the newsrooms I've been in. And I've actually taken safety trainings through other newsrooms as a freelancer. So I definitely have some grounding, but I will say it is very different across the board. There is not any sort of like mandatory training that people undergo or really standardized, even though there are some that have become more popular. So working in local news, I never received any type of training. And as far as I know, that is really the norm and has not necessarily changed. I think it probably is a bit location dependent. When I was in the larger newsroom and CAL FIRE came to speak with us, they told us that is something that's fairly common for them to do at this point. And I know being in California, that earthquake training is something that also tends to come up a bit more because you really are trying to help people understand how they can get there and be safe throughout the incident, and then also start reporting on it as fast as possible. The other type of training that's common is called HEFAT, and it's hostile environment first aid training. And that's something that is offered through organizations, kind of like on a grant basis, as well as through some newsrooms. And that's really trying to condense like all sorts of hostile environment situations you might be in like a 2 or 3 day course. So in those trainings, you will go through kidnapping sometimes. So what to do if you're in a situation when you're taken hostage. You'll be put through mass shooting situation training, basic first aid in terms of like how to even approach some of the things in a kit, creating a tourniquet, just like if you were in the aforementioned situations, how you could maybe not necessarily address someone's wounds, but just purely save a life. And I believe that's about it for HEFAT training. I think there was maybe like a quick module on fires and hurricanes, but the focus in those is really if you're in those environments where there's some sort of conflict going on. So those are kind of like the basic ones that are out there. And then again, I believe by locality, it can be a little bit different based on what your risks are, but it's not standardized and it's not super common in smaller newsrooms.
Thanks, Colleen. That was our safety officer asking that question, so.
Okay. Yeah,
Is
I
it-
can say it's whenever I've been in a newsroom where it's offered, it is highly in demand. Because it's not something that you're usually, you can't get everyone off the desk one day to do it. So you do it kind of like in rotating shifts. And you also do one thing that I know is kind of newer since the 2016 election and the number of journalist arrests and incidents that happened is you'll do protest training. How to walk through a protest and protect yourself, just kind of like how to approach those situations. So that one in particular, I have used a number of times, and that was really helpful. And again, I think any type of guidance on something like that is something newsrooms will be really open to, especially on the local level, because these trainings can be extremely expensive. And I know they are really only done on that kind of higher level of national or international.
So Colleen, real quick, inside baseball question. You maybe get asked this a lot, but since we're talking safety, why do reporters have to stand out in the middle of a hurricane?
Yeah, as a reporter who's done that, it's not the favorite. I think some of it is just like the norms and expectations that have come to be expected. Because it's like what people see when the storm happens. I mean, I know especially with like when people from the Weather Channel show up, people get really excited in those communities and they're like, they're here, it means it's a real storm. But yeah, I think it's something that also is kind of a carryover from, I mean, of course, you just want to show the situation. You want to prove to people why they shouldn't be out here or why this is so concerning. But I think it's something that I know as we are seeing kind of rapidly intensifying hurricanes that are changing that intensity as they're getting closer, or wildfires that are becoming so much less predictable. I think those conversations are happening in newsrooms where people are trying to figure out how can we do this, but also be maybe a bit safer doing it. Because I know some journalists have been in situations that, like I said, I mean, I had a colleague whose car washed away right in front of her. So it's certainly something that people are seeing the challenges with, but I can't say I think it's going away anytime soon.
Thanks, Colleen.
Thank you, Colleen. If there's anyone online who has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. But Colleen, I have one. Understanding that the level of trust with local government can sometimes with their community waver up and down. And it seems like during disasters, the trust with media goes up because a lot of people are at home watching TV, trying to get that level of information. In your experience, have you been embedded in an emergency operations center as a reporter, or have you seen any type of reporters being embedded in the emergency operations center to help facilitate that release of information? Or do you have any best practices on that? Because that's something that Jim has talked about, trying to facilitate that bridge between our local government and our local reporters and getting that information out, because we just want people to receive it and trust it and believe it. And if it's a unified front that we have to do, then we're all for it. But do you have any examples of that?
That's a really interesting idea. Off the top of my head, the only example that really comes to mind is New York City, and that was after 9/11 when they really revamped their emergency operations center. I know that they did a number of events where they had journalists come in and sort of took down that wall and were a bit more forthcoming about here's how the center works. I think some of it was, certainly people had concerns after 9/11 and were eager to see how the response had changed since then. But I mean, from my experience, that's not something that has been ongoing. I have never been embedded in an emergency operations center. I think it would be fascinating. Yeah, I think the question of trust is certainly a an incredibly important one on both sides, from local officials as well as with media. I am grateful that the perception is that more people trust it when disasters happen. I think that you are definitely onto something there, but of course, day to day, we've seen that trust really go down. I mean, I know I've even seen it throughout the course of my career, just in terms of what conversations look like with sources. And I think anything that can help raise that again would be great. I think what you're saying would be a really interesting proposal that I would imagine journalists would be really interested in. But of course, it's something I think that we're reckoning with on our side too, is how to kind of grow that trust again. Local news is certainly more within the communities, and I think has a bit more, has been able to keep a bit more trust, but especially on that national and international side, that is certainly a conversation that people are having, is how can we, really help people better understand the work that we're doing so that they understand why they can trust it.
That's great. Thank you, Colleen. Appreciate that. Do we have any questions online?
Colleen, while we wait for any other questions, might you want to share your blog and how people can follow you?
Oh, yes. Okay. So I do have just one more slide here, and it's just ways to stay in touch. That's where I am on social media. That is my email address. And then that little QR code you can scan and get straight to the sign up page for my newsletter. And I'll just say on that front, that has been really interesting for me, kind of going off of the question of trust. I pretty much wanted a space where I could put some extra context behind disaster news and do things like, I'm working on a piece right now that's just talking about like SBA loans. And I can't tell you how many times I've gotten that question when I've reported after disasters on like why a homeowner or a renter would be dealing directly with the Small Business Association. How many people have been concerned that they were like accidentally taking out a business loan that they were going to be on the hook for. So it was something where it's a question I've always heard, something I always wanted to write about. Never was the space to fit it in the articles I was doing. So with this newsletter, I'm able to do something like, here's how that program came about, here's why you should care, and have officials from the SBA as well as some experts who can kind of like put this all in perspective for readers. But I've had really amazing feedback from officials as well, people in the emergency management space who have said, well, here's a question I'm always coming up against. Is that something you could write about? So I'm really open to those conversations and just kind of creating a space where maybe there's a connection between some of the frontline communities. I have a lot of community organizers who subscribe, kind of giving them the information that they can then bring to impacted people. And just, again, this being a space where I don't have like the deadline needs or news peg needs that a lot of outlets are working in. So if you are interested, I'm really always open to feedback in that space or ideas. So I hope you'll check it out and get in touch about it.
Absolutely. All right, last call for questions in the room. Colleen, thank you so much. There's a question, Cheryl Simpson.
Hi, this is Cheryl Simpson. I'm with the Independent Center. We're a center for independent living. And I wanted to find out, did any of your journalism include the effects on people with disabilities?
Yes, so that is something that I have been able to do. And I think it's something that I've been eager to do more of, especially as I've been able to kind of like deepen my understanding about what sort of supports do and don't exist for different people. Here in California, especially, it's something that's come up when we have had, there's been the power shutoffs that they've been doing in recent years in areas where they think there's going to be wildfires, and particularly those events. It's something where if you usually know about it ahead of time, there's a lot of preparation that can be done. But if you are someone who needs electricity for some type of equipment, or if you need medication that's refrigerated, it's just a very significant level of extra need that exists there that maybe is not being addressed with the current policies in place around it. So it's something I've done, but something I've been eager to do a lot more of. Absolutely.
Okay, well, great. Okay. I know the Inclusive Disaster Strategies, they're an international disability group who,
Yep.
for every disaster,
so
they're
Colleen-
there. And they would be a good one to connect up with.
That's great to know. I am definitely going to follow up on that after this call. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. So Colleen, note that we are the first EUC to invite you to participate in our Emergency Operations Center whenever there's a disaster. So that'll be a standing invite, as well as should your time. This time next month, we're going to have a pretty involved discussion about the East Palestine incident in Ohio, and really having a conversation not only with our communications folks, and I think because of what you've said, we might invite some members of the media as well. But you know, folks from DEQ, EPA, our local fire and hazmat, state fire and hazmat, to really kind of talk that through. So if there's a perspective that you're looking for, again, you don't have to participate if you don't want to, but you're certainly welcome to observe, and we'll send you the link so that can happen.
Please do that. That sounds really interesting. I would love to be able to be a off-camera source in the room, checking all that out. I would love to hear more conversations around that.
Awesome. Well, Colleen, again, we appreciate so much you spending time with us, your perspectives. I got some notes I'm going to follow up on to improve the way we do things and how I personally can work with the media. Thank you. Thanks for everything. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, I look forward to staying in touch. I just might take you up on that one day. So thanks again. Yeah, and take care. I will jump off now.
Thank you. Thank you, Colleen.
And for those of you online, we will put the information for Colleen's website and that QR code in the notes. So in case you missed it, you'll be able to receive it from the minutes and notes when we put it out. So. All right. Yes, sir.
So folks, that's what we had. What we're experiencing, at least witnessing on the news in Ohio. I mean, you always hear the saying, you know, make sure you take advantage of a good disaster or never miss the opportunity to take advantage of a good disaster. And I think what we're seeing is really an opportunity to bounce it off of how we would be responding to a similar. I do have to think that if we had a derailment like that, then there's either some kind of mechanical failure or some nefarious purposes, because the rails go so slow through our community. We shouldn't see something like that. But that doesn't mean it would never happen. So we do have hazardous material products coming through the community. And I think we might work on getting an updated commodity flow study. And I think we can take, you know, whatever the product is, we can kind of work through the process of how, you know, our fire marshals and hazmat teams would work with the state. And just as importantly, a unified message, and how we can identify vulnerable individuals in those areas who are dependent on electricity, or others who might need transportation to go to a shelter. I mean, it's such a complex incident that if we don't take time, to talk it through when there's an example being presented to us, then I think we'd be more than not being remiss. I, as an emergency manager, would be negligent if I don't do it. So this time next month, I suspect we'll be back at the second precinct, right?
Yes.
We'll be back at 9 and 1 Asbury for a really good discussion. Called a panel discussion, but I suspect folks who aren't on the panel will also be engaged and have a lot to share. So Eve, I see that you're on right now. You got an invite. We want to make sure public health is engaged with that or otherwise included because of the role that you guys play in the sampling of the water and all kinds of things. So we just want everyone to have a good understanding of the hazard, a good understanding of what our plan will say, because it's being updated as we speak, what resources exist and how we all work together in response to this particular event. Are there any questions about that? Anthony Lloyd from Operation Blessing, I see you're on, so I suspect Operation Blessing is going to pay for everyone's lunches and snacks during the event, and I'm kidding, sir. Hope all is well over there.
Yeah. Hey, Jim. No, I hear you talking. Yeah, call me offline. I've watched the news. I think this is really timely. I do think that in Norfolk, you have something that's a little different wrinkle than they have in New Palestine, depending upon how close it is to a federal waterway, because EPA is the federal on-scene coordinator on the inland zone, and the Coast Guard assumes it for the coastal zone. Knowing where that line is always something that, surprisingly, even in this day and age of GIS, I see there's a commander on the line. He may be able to work with you to find out where is that line, so you don't have any confusion on the federal on-scene coordinator side. Just sort of like that's a stray thought. Trying not to drag your meeting out, though.
No, I appreciate that. And the Coast Guard experience that you bring. Is there anyone else that wanted to speak to the water component and that how the Coast Guard owns incidents over the water? All right, well, so Anthony, certainly Coast Guard will be invited to that meeting, as will the Weather Service, quite honestly, because if we start talking plume modeling and what they bring to the table for hazmat responses, what tools are used to determine plume, and based on the forecasts and everything else, we really hope for a good comprehensive discussion that can be brought down to my level of understanding. So again, we can have a really good solid plan moving forward.
Jim, one more thing.
Yes, sir.
Back when I was involved, NOAA's scientific support coordinators ran the models for hazardous material releases for the Coast Guard. I think the EPA has their own modeling component. So there might be somebody in NOAA, either through the district or the sector, that you can find out who the NOAA scientific support coordinator is. Of course, it's good to have a discussion that stresses all the potential interagency relationships. So the line is a line on the map, and therefore it'd be good to pressure everybody into discussion at least beforehand, so you can say, okay, well, who do you use for modeling? Who's the federal? Who's the state? Who's the Norfolk expert? Nothing you haven't been doing for a long time.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony. Dana, you want to do the roundtable?
Well, certainly. So this is an opportunity for all of us in the room and all of us online just to be able to have this moment to be able to discuss operations with their business, their department, anything that's up and coming that you would like people to know about. We provide this opportunity to you. If there's something you need help with or you're requesting help with, if there's training that you foresee that would be beneficial to everybody, the roundtable discussion is your time to be able to have these connections with people you normally wouldn't have on a daily basis. So we emphasize that this is your time. So if you do have any questions, I don't foresee us going down the line online asking everybody individually, because there's quite a few. But please go ahead and raise your hand if you have something that you would like to pass out on Microsoft Teams, and then we'll call on you. And here, most certainly, if you have anything, please let us know and we can have that discussion. I'll start off with one. I know everybody has seen the terrible, terrible earthquake that happened overseas in Turkey and Syria. And I want to put out that we are hosting another CERT class. It's the Community Emergency Response Team that we have for Norfolk, and it's starting on March 7th. And the CERT team will go over stop the bleed, CPR, search and rescue, everything that you would need to be able to be a part of a team that can be deployed during incidents for the city. This is a fantastic course that will be held on Tuesdays through the month of March. And then there is a final training day on a Saturday where you'll have a real life scenario to where you'll get to apply everything you've learned in the course, and then have that hands-on experience to build that confidence to be able to be a part of the CERT team. And our CERT team members are used throughout the year as part of our emergency operations and special events that we have downtown, or even if we have something that's a natural disaster and we need assistance with our community response team, we'll deploy them and they will help us. And then most importantly, it's just a way for you to be able to have that knowledge to check on your neighbors, to say that you have that experience, or to be called upon if somebody is having a heart issue. It's that confidence that builds in you to be able to respond to those emergencies. So that's coming up. If you'd like more information, please let us know. You can email me, Karen, or Scott, and we'll make sure you get the application to fill it out. But it is worth your time, and we definitely would like for you to join us with that. And as Jim mentioned, next month, LEPC meeting, we'll go over that disaster up in East Palestine. So we're looking forward to that conversation. And our thoughts right now also are with the students and the faculty and everybody at MSU. And Jared, our thoughts are with you and your teams as well over there. As any type of events that happen, we always think about our partners close to home. So Jared, if there's anything that you need from your ODU community, I know these times can be very sensitive when we're seeing active threat situations in other universities and colleges across. But Jared, is there anything that you need from your side, sir, about this?
No, Daniel, but thanks for bringing that up. And it's definitely something we're monitoring, and our hair goes on the back of our neck every time we hear of yet another one of those incidents taking place.
Oh, certainly. Well, we're here if you need us. Just let us know if there's anything we can do, okay?
You bet, we'll do.
All right. So I see we have a hand raised. So Kim from Centera.
Hi, so I just wanted to actually thank you guys for hosting this virtually as well. I've had a conflict the last several months that I've not been able to get over there, and so reading the notes afterwards is, it's good, but it's not as good as interacting with you all. The second thing I wanted to kind of comment on is, as I'm hearing y'all talk about the hazmat and the train derailment and things like that, and I did see Blake from Norfolk General was on. But, I wanted to make sure that we've got somebody from Norfolk General potentially, participating in that discussion with you, or, we're happy to participate from the system level as well. Because as we, could potentially have first responders or even, citizens, with some hazmat exposure and things like that, and in need of decon, we, just want to make sure that, we're kind of on the same, page with you all as far as your planning and all of that, and, know what you guys are looking at, so that, we can be better prepared to receive those folks if they do show up at our EDs.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tim. And I see Blake is not, dang it. I should have turned to him.
Yep, I saw him earlier, but
to get his thoughts on.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you again.
All right. Anyone else? HRT, Red Cross, utilities? Anybody have anything that they would like to pass out?
Well, the Red Cross will be in Norfolk doing Sound the Alarm, which is installing smoke alarms in March. The first Saturday of March. We partner with the Norfolk Fire Department, pick a community and go door to door, trying to get people to have working smoke alarms in their house.
Excellent. Thank you. And that is in March, you said?
Yes, it is.
All right.
Should be the first Saturday in March.
Excellent.
Do you know what area specifically or no?
I don't have my high school area this year.
Okay. I only ask because we might be able to help. We'll ask the message to that area, let them know about.
Send you there.
Okay. Thanks.
Another opportunity for CERT team members to be deployed as well. Yep. Anybody else online? All right. Hearing none, seeing none, I do want to thank Kim for bringing up the hybrid solution that we have today. We have dabbled in this a couple times and we didn't have the right equipment, but Jim has graciously allowed us to get an OWL solution to be able to provide the video technology that was needed to host these meetings hybrid. Although in person, is the best solution so we can see everybody and communicate. Hybrid virtual is an excellent solution as well. So we appreciate your time of joining us virtually, and we appreciate your time of those who volunteer. And we will send out another meeting invite for next month's LEPC meeting for the disaster over in East Palestine, Ohio. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.